Thank you, Joy. And thank you, Ms. Shotwell and others for inviting me here today. I understand that you have already had at least one other speaker, a guest speaker. Is that right? And 6 or 7. Okay. Well, the one that stuck out in my excellent host's memories was the speaker on Mr. Lincoln's funerals, his death and funerals around the country. Certainly the saddest day in our national history, some people say, when Mr. Lincoln was killed. But today we have a happier subject. The topic is We Knew Lincoln, or Mr. Lincoln and His Friends. And I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then for the next 20 or 30 minutes after that, we will have questions and answers. Well, we'll have questions, certainly. I'll try to have answers for you, too. And if while I'm speaking at any time, anyone has a question or you don't understand a word or anything like that, please raise your hand and we'll settle that, okay? You see a couple of things behind me, a couple of maps behind me. I'll point to those for a little bit, and then I'll also be holding up some pictures to illustrate a little bit of what I'm talking about. So the first thing to find out, I think some of you may know this, what year was Abraham Lincoln born? Yes? 1809. Very good. And how do you know that? Well, you're right. And what was last year? Right. It was the 200th birthday of Mr. Lincoln. So that's why we had a lot of celebration here in Springfield and around the country to celebrate that round number. And it's always a good time to stop and think about how he has influenced our lives today, which he certainly has, but maybe not in all that many ways. I'll show you here on the map, for example, the first couple of things that would have been important to Mr. Lincoln and the people he knew him when he was a little kid. Who knows what state he was born in? Yes? You. Kentucky. Very good. And that is here. More or less in the center of the country between the north and the south. South of the Ohio River. Kentucky was a slave state at the time. The Lincolns were poor, white, working people who did not have much education at all. They had a very difficult time competing in a place like that. There were all kinds of slaves in their county and in their state who worked for free, more or less, for the people who owned them. Yes? Well, that means that Thomas Lincoln, for example, Abraham's father, who was a farmer trying to feed his family, he was also a pretty good carpenter. But if he offered to make a nice desk or a table for a wealthy plantation owner, why would that plantation owner need to hire him to make a desk for him? He may well have had a slave who could make it for him, a slave for whom he would only have to provide materials and no other pay. So this made it difficult for people without special skills to do very well in that state. And that is one reason that the Lincolns left Kentucky and a whole lot of other people like them during the years of slavery. So they moved north of the Ohio River into Indiana, which was a free state. And they set up a little farm in the middle of the woods. Abraham was chopping wood pretty much every day from about the time he was 6 or 7 years old into his 20s. That's probably part of the reason he grew sort of tall, but in general, a lot of people said that as an adult, he was the strongest person they ever saw. And he wasn't the only person who chopped a lot of wood. He chopped wood with the neighbor kids and the neighbor adults, but he was particularly good at it, apparently, and grew big and strong. And they cut out a farm for themselves in the woods in southern Indiana. Now, one thing that this map shows, and it's a little hard to tell from where you're sitting maybe, but I'll try to point it out. This is for the years 1825 to 1830. That is when Abraham was a teenager. The thick red lines show the roads in the country. Now, one smart kid asked me earlier, did people have carriages and horses? Is that how they got around? And the answer is yes. But if you had a horse, you were doing pretty well, and if you had a carriage, you were doing really well. Poorer people sometimes didn't have a carriage, and so you walked around through the mud, mostly. And there weren't many of those anyway. They only went through the big towns. The Lincolns lived out here in the middle of southern western Kentucky. There were no roads. There was only mud. When they got up to southern Indiana, it was better, gradually. Now, the grayer line here, sort of greenish gray, shows canals. Who knows what a canal is? Yes?
A canal is kind of a small riverway
Mm-hmm.
that can be accessible for plenty of ships to use, but has some water level changes.
Very good. Very important. Water level changes through the year, depending on whether it's summer or winter, and how high the rivers it connects might be. So Abraham got himself a couple of jobs as a young man. He worked with another fellow to build a little boat and put it on the Ohio River and at the shore, and would get into it, and a couple of people who wanted to get out into the middle of the river onto a big steamboat that was going down the river to St. Louis, Memphis, New Orleans, would want to get onto the big steamboat. So he would get them a little ride into his boat and charge them 6 1/4 cents for the ride out. That's what the price was. And that was his first real job for money that he got to keep himself. Otherwise, the law was that a kid had to give all of his or her money to their father from whatever jobs they had. This was a sore point for Abraham and his sister Sarah and the other kids they knew. But that was the law until he was a teenager, and Abraham could keep some of that own money because he had built the little boat. And the canals were making it much easier for people to get to the river and making it much easier for people to get around the country in general. But you probably know a couple of things that happened next. Abraham's mother died in Indiana when he was 9 years old. It was a very sad day. His father went back to Kentucky and found a lady that he'd known most of his life named Sarah. She had 3 children of her own, and her husband had died. They each needed a new spouse, and they quickly got married, and Sarah and her family, her 3 kids, came up to Indiana and moved into the little cabin with the Lincolns. Has any of you been in the Presidential Museum down here? Great. Glad to hear it. Well, the first thing you go in on one side of the museum is that little cabin where they lived in Indiana. It's exactly the size of the real cabin in Indiana where the Lincolns lived. There were 8 people living in that cabin. I'm sure you all love sharing a bedroom with a brother or sister. Yes, a sore point for some. But in a cabin that was about 10 feet by 14 feet with 8 people living in it, it was a very crowded and unpleasant time. They had to be patient. Yes?
That's 1 person for every 2 square feet.
Excellent way to put it. That's why some people spend a lot of time outdoors. Yes?
Yeah, but 1 story house with a basement and 8 people, we had to make extra rooms.
Well done. So you know about being patient and kind to people near you. Sort of like being in a classroom all day. Sort of different.
All day, every day.
Yeah.